Welcome back to Anchored and Devoted with Pastors Jer and Joseph.
I'm glad you guys are here.
There you go. There he is. We are ecstatic that you're here. I know we both want to say thank you for, if this is your first episode, then yes, thank you for being willing to listen to the other ones. But hopefully you've listened to some of them in order. So we thank you for listening to the other ones. And please take a moment to share your favorite one with us and let us know some of the topics we should talk about next year. I know Jared and I were just talking about having guests on the show. It's not a show, on the podcast next year. And so if there are certain pastors, leaders, authors that you'd like for us to engage with, and especially if you know them or have a connection with them that, be easy to introduce us to, we'd love to connect with them and talk to them about their spiritual journey with Christ and how we can help others on their journey with Christ, walking with Him.
Yeah, that'd be really cool. And Dave left out restaurateurs. Is any restaurateurs that you know we will interview them?
and gyms. Gyms would be good too.
Auto dealerships.
Okay, now we're getting extra. or anyone who owns a bank. Oh mercy.
What are we talking about today, man?
Today our topic is your purpose. We've got a two-part episodes back to back, one on your calling, which is the second one, and then the first one's on your purpose. And we're going to start there. So Jeremy, when someone is lost or confused or trying to understand what their purpose is, how do you help them? What do you tell them?
The very first place that we have to go is to God Himself. I think it was A.W. Tozer, it may have been J.I. Packer. I think it was Tozer, though, said that the most important thought that a man has when he thinks about himself is his understanding of God. Because God is the creator, because we are His creation, just like an artist or a sculptor is the one who determines what the use is or the goal for the creation that they make, just like an engineer is the one that determines how a tool that he has designed is to be used, we have a design. And God has built all of His creation with the same design, but humans in particular, there's an asterisk there, that there's an additional purpose in our design. And fundamentally, God has done all things for the glory of His name. I start there. We have to start with everything God has done has been and is to bring glory to Himself. So in the creation of the world, in my life, the foundational purpose is I exist that God might be glorified. Now, as the Westminster Confession of Faith says, in answer to this question, which is question 1 in its catechism, what is the chief end of man? It says that the chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. That second part is what separates us from the rest of creation. God has built into us the design, not just that we would glorify Him, but that a part of that glorification would be enjoying Him. And that is talking about relationship. That separates us, that makes us distinct from everything else that God created. Stars, moon, ducks, gnats, they don't exist to enjoy God. They exist to glorify Him. The psalmist talks about this, says that the works of God's hands declare His glory, but what they don't do is enjoy Him. They don't get to walk with Him in the cool of the day the way that Adam did. They don't get to walk with Him in His throne room the way that we see humanity doing at the end of Revelation, when God has brought all things to their completion. And in the completion, it's not just a worship service worshiping God, but it is a relationship between the church and the bride of Christ and the husband, Christ, between the church and other believers, and between all of humanity and God. That's the purpose for which God created us. That's the purpose for which Christ came and died. That's the reason that He was raised from the dead. That's the reason that He's coming back to take back His own. So I start there. How do you answer it?
I think our purpose is to worship God. I think in worship, we do enjoy him. Um, in worship, we worship whether it's a good day or a bad day. We worship whether we've gotten good news or bad news, because our purpose is centered in the work of Christ, and His grace and love. It allows me to express joy
Mm.
in the relationship by worshiping. So I would wholeheartedly agree that everyone is built, whether you're a believer or non-believer, for relationship. Like this is part of how God created us. But I do believe our purpose as new believers is to look at relationship differently than when we didn't, and that's part of our purpose is to engage with the world in a unique way, very much as you were saying, to glorify God. It's uh, done in a way that is not simply um, or only um, lifting him up on the days where I feel good, but it's out of relationship with him that I can glorify him. I can praise him. I can learn from him. I can, as we see
Right.
in the Old Testament, wrestle with him. Those heart issues, those places where self is still holding on to the old nature. Um, that is um, what we are um, created to do. We are um, broken. And God takes all of those cracks and flaws and areas that need Him, He fills them. And it is out of that that people are attracted to Him, not to us. And that is part of our purpose. It is
Yeah.
um, to make Him known,
Yes.
and that's part of glorifying Him. And as you stated, to enjoy Him in that process. These aren't two separate things. Um, and that's why I consider it worship. Now, for certain people, worship isn't worship like I worship, so I guess I got to define. For certain people, worship is I sang the hymnals and I was good. Whereas for me, worship is all encompassing, fully engaged, um, childlike freedom found in celebrating who God is, his love for me as well as those that are lost,
Hmm.
the fact that I get to be family with him, all condensed into this long suffering love that just kind of makes me continually happy and recognizing that any issue of the day is just noise. And
Right.
so I can rejoice. I can, I can worship, and um, I can help others as I go through tough seasons. This is my purpose. When I look at, uh, um, and we talked about this earlier, the story of Joseph. It's not
Yeah.
a life where you could say it was a straight line for him to live out his purpose, or an easy life or a comfortable life for him to live out his purpose. Joseph very much, um, in prison could have spent much of his season crying, weeping, and naturally being upset with God.
Yes.
He'd already been sold into slavery. Now he's working in Potiphar's house. He says that he's not going to sleep with his master's wife out of respect for God, and God doesn't stop him from going to jail, which is
Right.
well, I can see a church service now. We are going to pray that Brother Jared does not get life in prison, um, assuming that we know better. And um, he's there, and he is so into the space of worship where um, those in charge don't fear him leading.
Right.
You don't fear him having responsibilities, which is the opposite of what you think, because he was just demoted significantly or tried and convicted um, for not living in a way that was honorable. And
Mm.
so his purpose is one where, He was living out his purpose. He definitely had a calling on his life. And like I said, we'll get into that later. But his purpose was one where he continued to worship even till the end. He wasn't defined by the pressures of the world. And
Right.
I think that is one of the things I want to hit on next, if you don't mind. Um, when you are engaging with someone who's wrestling with what is my purpose, why am I here, like that's often the
Hmm.
question I get. Why am I here now? um, what words of encouragement do you give them? Do you go straight to the text? Like, what do you do when someone says, why am I here?
You know, the question almost never comes without a context.
Hmm.
Um, the person that's asking this question, and I'll be honest, most often when I hear this question, it's not actually a soul cry. It's
Hmm.
a philosophical wrangling.
Okay.
It's a philosophical jousting. Um, and to that, I'll lay out just as I did. But I think it's more important as the church to be able to answer this question in the lesser context of the person who is, who's been in the spot that both you and I have been in before, where things are not going the way that we expected that they would. Um, we're doing the algebra on both sides of the equation. It's not adding up the way that we know it's supposed to.
Hmm.
And all of a sudden we're asking this question to that person, why am I here? Why is God doing this? What is going on and what is the purpose? Um, my answer is it's a long answer. It's a
We
long
have the time.
conversation. Yeah, it starts with this. It starts with a meeting the person right where they are in that pain, in the midst of that confusion, and um, staying there with them until they're actually themselves looking for me to speak back into it. Because oftentimes, a person who's asking that question is not asking for an intellectual answer.
Mhm.
Most often, they can come up with the intellectual answer themselves. They already know it. Most often, what they're saying is, I've lost the ability to hope.
Mm.
And the only thing that can be done for that is that God can reach in and reach them with his comfort. And so my response to that is not one to the person directly, but my response is to immediately go to prayer for them while they're sitting there with me or on the phone, whatever the case might be. The second is to assure them that in the midst of their struggle, I care deeply for them and I care deeply that they are walking through this. I understand what it means, having experienced it myself, to face despair, to face hopelessness.
Mhm.
I know how difficult that is. I wished that I could remove that from their experience at this moment. Because I can't, the best I can offer is to be with them in love. And when they're ready, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remind them of the love that God has already demonstrated to them. Because the only answer to despair is hope. The only answer to hopelessness is to remember what has been done already and what will come in the future. And so I start by looking backwards and remind them that God has already cared for the greatest need that they had. He's already accepted them. He's already poured out his love onto them through the coming and the death and the resurrection of his son on their behalf. And then I am going to transition to an eternal perspective that looks at and frames the sufferings that we experience here temporally in these 70 or 120 years in light of eternity.
Mhm.
Because in the light of eternity, this amount of suffering, whether it's 3 days or 30 years or an entire lifetime, begins to have a more accurate and a more um, useful scale in
Mhm.
our minds. And it might sound like I'm just playing mind games, but again, it's like saying, "Hey, it's raining outside, and I'm going to get soaked if I go to the car." And then taking someone to a pool and say, "No, you're going to get soaked if I dump you in that pool. If you walk through this rain, you're going to get a little bit wet." There is a difference. There's a qualitative, a quantitative, a real difference in scale, and one is a lot easier than the other. So if that's the case, if one thing is actually harder than the other, or longer than the other, or shorter than the other, then we can look at the one that is better and stand in the one that is worse in light of that. And so as I look at eternity, it's not just the joy, the fulfillment, the satiation of heaven that I look to.
Mm.
More than that, it is God's love poured out on them in the perfection that He's always intended for this person to walk in with Him. God's entire purpose has not been, and this is where I have to get back to, because this is where the application really comes in. This is where the soul searching comes in, and the work of the Holy Spirit goes into to convict and to heal.
Mhm.
God's purpose for this person, regardless of how injurious the circumstances in which they find themselves in fact are, God's purpose is not that they would live in this life without that struggle.
Mm.
His purpose is that in this life they would glorify Him, which means in this struggle they would endure for His glory, or they would perish to His glory. Revelation 4, I think it's 17, says, "You are God and Lord, are worthy to receive glory and power and honor and dominion, because you created all things, and by you all things were created." And Scripture goes on to say that all things were created for your pleasure. The hiccup that does scare me as a believer, as I'm talking to people, is this idea that God has created all things for His pleasure. But that's what He's communicated. Everything that God has done and made has been because He chose to, because it pleased Him to do so. And that includes whatever suffering you or I walk through. He chose that for His pleasure. He allowed that for His pleasure, and He uses that for our good. And we don't always see that. We can't always see that, but we can't see things from an eternal perspective when we live temporally. We can't see things fully from an eternal perspective. And so we can't see how God's going to work these things out many times until we are actually on the other side of that veil and we're looking at the backside of the clock from the Maker's point of view. And we can see what He's been doing. But that kind of trust is only possible if I trust that this God who did this for His pleasure really, truly, deeply, eternally, unconditionally loves me
Mm.
and is towards me. And so all of this, the answer is I have to talk to them about love.
Mm.
The person that's experiencing this, it's not just relationship, but it's the reality of love. If you have had a parent, if you've had a sibling, if you've had a friend, if you've had a child, my guess is you have at some point either experienced real love or you experienced something that let you see what real love ought to be because of the failures of what you did experience. In either case, all of us have a yearning and a knowledge of what real love is, and we long for it. And God satisfies that. He created us to find our satisfaction in His love. And the person who's asking this question, that's where I'm going to turn back to with them, is to meditate on and wallow in the reality that there's a loving God who is towards me, who's demonstrated His love, who will be faithful in His love, and will hold me through all things until until the time when his love is in fullness poured out on me and I can fully enter into it, when I'm made whole to be able to experience that holy, perfect love. What do you think, sir?
I'm thinking about how um, what you're stating is right in line with 1 Corinthians 7:17. How each person should live, at least the verse states, each person should live as a believer in whatever situation the Lord has assigned them,
Yeah.
just as God has called them. That there is um, a uniqueness to you being in this time, this place, and this season uh, with God that allows for Him um, to be glorified. And the opportunity is to not see the situation as one where it isn't an opportunity. It's an opportunity to glorify Him. The question is, do I embrace this love even in the midst of whatever's going on? Now,
Right.
know that, kind of like you were sharing, Jared, whenever the purpose question comes up, it's wrestling with um, a heart concern, but it's not normally during the midst of a trial per se, but it's
Right.
because of trials that have occurred, or how can this happen, kind of thinking, or wrestling with
Yeah.
larger things. And you have to get back to that place of being able to trust God, and um, as well as love God. um, it's uh, part of your purpose is to do both of those things, as well as to be set apart for His use.
Yes.
So you can't walk out or live out your purpose if you don't genuinely believe, and you also can't live out your purpose if you aren't willing to do the work that God has called you to do. So when someone comes to church on Sunday and they tell me they believe, and yet their actions bear fruit that is contrary, um, this isn't that hard. You would say they don't believe. Example, I mean, we always use the chair example. If you believe in the chair, you sit in it. If you don't believe, you'll stand in my office the whole time. Uh,
For
so
sure.
there are actions that let us know the actions, again, don't define you. It is the work of Christ that defines you. If you choose to believe in Him, that freedom that's found in Him allows you not to um, um, have to be defined by the pressures of the world that often say you have to do things of value to others to matter. And so often when I hear the purpose question, it's I'm not a doctor, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a nurse, I'm not a teacher, so I don't feel as though I have value. And
Mm.
that value can only be defined by the work of Christ, where He has made it abundantly clear those labels don't matter. Those labels of anything often stop people from embracing the fullness of the work of Christ,
Right.
the blessing of the gift, where I can now love those that are my neighbors, no matter what race, no matter how much they make, no matter anything, as long as they bear the image of God, because they are created in His image. I can now know that my purpose is to relate to them just as God has related to me. And that is freeing, because now I can forgive, I can love, I can trust. Not that I have to worry about this other individual, because I'm loving and trusting and believing in God, and I know He's going to work this out even if it doesn't look right. So when I look at the life, going back to Joseph, he can worship in his workplace because he is free to, knowing that God has him, and he doesn't have to worry about, if he's forgotten. Yes, he will speak up. He's not going to be stepped upon, but he's not going to live in fear. He's not going to live in foolishness either. He's going to live a free life defined by the work of Christ. And that's out of that we see our purpose being fulfilled, because there's much to enjoy about God. There's much to celebrate about what He's done in our lives, and there's much work to do around us. Um, and doing it with Him is our purpose. It's not just to do good work for Him as though we're earning our salvation. We aren't. We're working with Him. We are yoked with Him, and it is a pleasure. Um, it is a joy to work with Him.
Mm. So I wonder if I can turn the conversation again. You're saying that the purpose of the reason that we're here, our purpose, is not fundamentally to be fulfilled and to be happy. Am I reading that right?
Yes, happiness is to be joyful. And I'd say joy is based upon you having a healthy perspective of the cross. And
Mm-hmm.
that allows you to see everything in light of the cross. So therefore, you are full of joy.
Yeah.
It's not happiness. It's not based off of the promotion or the new car or the new house or any new thing that really isn't new under the sun.
Right. Right. And so here's the reason I ask that, because conceptually, not only in our culture, but in
any culture,
in capital L liberal societies, where we've come out of the Enlightenment, we believe in the benefit and the dignity of mankind. There is the idea and even the ideal that we exist to, our purpose is to be fulfilled. And I'm going to put this out there this way. It's not just believers who have the purpose of glorifying God and enjoying Him. It is not just believers who have the purpose of worshiping God. It is also non-believers. It is also our neighbors who are our pagan neighbors, our secular neighbors, our atheist neighbors.
I don't think
Every
I like
single
being called
one of them. Well, I didn't.
You
The
heathens.
Bible did. No, I meant the ones actually worshiping the twig.
Oh, gotcha. As opposed to the Corvette. Got it.
Yeah, exactly. Different kind of metal. Every single person that has been born of woman has been born with the inheritance of this same purpose, which is why we spend so much of our lives, whether or not we are Christian, wrestling with this question and pursuing this thing called purpose, which is tied up with identity. It's tied up with our fulfillment. It's tied up with our calling and our vocation. It's tied up with the way that we spend our time and our money. It's all tied up in there, and at the root of it is this inconvenient truth that the world oftentimes chooses to ignore, chooses to push down, that we were created to worship God. That is why He gave us life. And the single greatest reason that so much angst exists in the world is that we reject that purpose. Because at the end of the day, and we've talked about this before, there is one God-sized throne, and it only holds one person. And for most of us, we see that throne and we believe our purpose is to sit up in it. And God says, no, that's my chair, that's my seat, and you're going to be much, much happier when I sit there and when you are before me face to face, receiving my love, not trying to take my place. And whether you're a non-believer or a believer, at the heart of dissatisfaction, at the heart of despair, is the seed of idolatry that says, no, I deserve better than this. I deserve to be praised. I deserve to be worshipped. I deserve identified and approved and accepted. And because I'm not, and because I can't force someone else to do that, Dave, you haven't yet been able to force me to give you adulation. I mean, you're bigger than me. You can beat me up. You can tear me down. You can laugh at me. You can belittle me. You can do a whole lot of things. You can buy me a car. You can do a bunch of things, but you can't force me to worship you in my heart. And God doesn't do that to us. He invites us to, because He's designed us such that when we do worship Him in our hearts with our lives, we will be the most fulfilled, the most satisfied, the most filled up. Which, for me as a believer, should be a really powerful reason to be speaking to my non-believing neighbor. If I really do believe this, if I really do believe that God hasn't simply given a purpose to Christians, but has made all mankind for His pleasure, for His glory, then, as you're saying, this worship, a big part of this worship, is then metamorphosized into evangelism, into sharing the good news.
It is. It's a natural outcome of your purpose. As we get in the calling, we'll talk about some of the specificity of it as you see in the Word, but you can't not. You can't hide the most important relationship in your life. You can't
Yeah.
hide the one who loves you the most. It's one of my one of my favorite memories of all time is in high school. My mom came to a football game, and she came to most football games with blue and gold on, and she had these cowbells that she would ring nonstop. And this was before people had cowbells. Like this was a minute ago, so this was not the end thing. Um,
That's
this
awesome.
this wasn't in the season, of air horns and cowbells. And her love was such that it was embarrassing. Like you you I'm laughing now because I can see her, and I can see my sister standing next to her with this hat on, looking at my mom like, what is wrong with her?
I can see your sister standing next to your mom doing that.
Like, what really is wrong with this woman? It's love. Like it's genuine love. She loved me and I love her. I love my
Yeah.
sister. I love you. And it's one of those things where I don't care where we go. And you and I have been to restaurants where we've been embarrassing one another as well as embarrassing, period. I
Yep.
can't disown you because you're family in Christ and that's it. And to look at uh, life outside of worship or to try and live out your purpose in only 1 hour of the week or an hour and a half of the week is so it's impossible.
Yep.
It's not realistic. It's not what you're created for. You're created to be, and that be part is consistent. It's not
Yes.
I take it off and put it on. You're created to be with Him, in Him, and to abide.
Yes.
That's our purpose, to worship out of that abiding. I can't make myself any less than or more than because it's all about Him. Has nothing to do with me.
Right.
you know.
Right.
And I have to give that away as well. I have to share that. I have to let that go.
Yes.
And I have to worship. Like I have
Yep.
to I have to move. I can't sit still. I can't hide it. It's embarrassing.
Yeah. So there's one other thing that I think we need to touch on in the 2 or 3 minutes here.
Okay.
Because we've already said we've been created to worship,
Mm-hmm.
to glorify God. We've been created to love and to be loved, to know and be known.
Yep.
We've been created to declare that back out to the world around us. That there is one last thing that that I think needs to be talked about before calling, and that is we have been called, we have been made to be perfect. We've been made to be holy.
Yes, to
We've
be
been
holy.
made to be righteous.
Yeah.
And that has been broken. When you take any one of these four things and you are not them. You're not loved.
Hmm.
You're not loving. You're not holy. You're not glorifying God. You're not known and being known by Him. You're not declaring His goodness to the world. You cannot reach a level of satisfaction, satiation, and fulfillment that you were in fact created to experience. God is, He's made us with those four things. And this is an exhaustive list, but this last one of holiness is hitting me because we haven't talked about it. And I think it needs to be in this grouping.
Hmm.
God created us to be perfect. He didn't just call us to be perfect. In fact, He's called us to be perfect because when we were created to be perfect, we didn't keep with our calling. We didn't keep with that purpose. Within that purpose, we fell from that purpose. Even so, He has still called us to be holy. And here's the great thing. Those four things that God has made us to be, made us to do, our purpose that we fall short of, God Himself steps into the middle and picks up all that slack through Christ. We did not glorify God, but Christ did. He glorified God perfectly. We did not walk as righteous, but Christ did, perfectly fulfilling the law, perfectly loving, perfectly knowing and being known by God and living face to face with His Father. Because Christ did that, we have entrance into not just that perfection, but that satisfaction that Christ has now as He's seated next to the Father in power on high. That's what we've been called to. We have been called to be co-heirs with Christ, heirs of God, co-heirs with Christ. He's made us to live there. If you're falling short of your purpose, it's because your purpose is to be a co-heir of Christ. If you're not satisfied and you feel like you're not hitting the mark that you thought you would, look back to what the mark really is. That's where it's been set, and the great news is God has already made that way possible through Christ and through the work of the Holy Spirit. It can be done in you. And you, even in this life, even in suffering, even in rejection, can not only experience the satisfaction of living out your purpose, but the joy of knowing and experiencing the perfection that God has called us to as His people, as His children and creation. So wrap it up there. We can talk about calling in the next episode, but I hope that you guys are encouraged. I'm really grateful that you stopped by to hang out with us for these 33 minutes. And I bless you. Go in the power and the grace, the knowledge of the calling that God has given to you. Live out your purpose today. Take care.